So now we come to something else that recently happened. Was this Dr. Donald B. Moss released a paper that I actually paid to read, that I will be going into later in the video. But it turns out that it's actually, a lot of it was available publicly in just his like promotions for his upcoming book. But the paper in question is entitled "On Having Whiteness." As in, whiteness is something you can have, like a condition. We'll be going over that momentarily. It's called "On Having Whiteness" by Donald Moss. But first, I just want to take from this because it kind of gives you a lot of insight. But here's your guy, Donald B. Moss, is the chair of the National Program Committee. His new book, called co-edited with Len Zevin, "Hating, Abhorring, and Wishing to Destroy: Psychoanalytic Essays on the Contemporary Moment," is forthcoming in the new Library of Psychoanalysis. So I want to emphasize again why this kind of stuff is dangerous, because these people are finding their way into gaining credibility in psychoanalysis. And what this will inevitably mean is, for the same reasons why it's been dangerous in sociology, is that these people will eventually be able to start treating people for whiteness, which is basically what he suggests in the paper that we'll be going over in a moment. But first of all, I will focus on whiteness as a condition one first acquires and then has a malignant, parasitic-like condition to which white people have a particular susceptibility. The condition is foundational, generating characteristic ways of being in one's body, in one's mind, and in one's world. Parasitic whiteness renders its host's appetites voracious, insatiable, and perverse. These deformed appetites particularly target non-white peoples. Once established, these appetites are nearly impossible to eliminate. Effective treatment consists of a combination of psychic and social historical interventions. What the hell that? Social historical. Anyway, such interventions can reasonably aim only to reshape whiteness's infiltrated appetites, to reduce their intensities, to redistribute their aims, and to occasionally turn those aims toward the work of reparation. When remembered and represented, the ravages wreaked by the chronic condition can function either as a warning of never again, or as a temptation, great again. Memorialization alone, therefore, is no guarantee against regression. There is not yet a permanent cure. An excerpt from my article on having whiteness. This is like before he had released it, but anyway. Of course, whiteness confers that what is commonly called privilege on white people, and privilege indeed it is. No demographic measure can serve to contest that. Fueled by whiteness's insatiable appetites, affected white people have found biblical sanction as they seek to achieve dominion over other peoples. The resulting affliction engenders a Midas-like state. All non-white humans treated as currency, as a kind of gold, to be taken, possessed, owned, commemorated, dominated, and finally passed on, one generation to the next, forever and ever, into perpetuity. The appetite for dominion has spawned an entire cultural apparatus that serves as its rationale and justification. This cultural apparatus, the Western canon, is at least as old as the ironically named Enlightenment, and both envision and incarnate a Ptolemy-like mechanism to describe life on Earth. Whiteness occupies the center of this apparatus, while the rest of the non-white world revolves around it, as though in a massive lazy Susan, providing that center with what it takes as an endless feast of serviceable items. From the beginning, all the people who have ever been positioned in this lazy Susan have been in constant and steady revolt against their placement there. That resistance seems now, as it may have often have seemed before, to be rising to an irresistible and irreversible pitch. Here, offering himself as witness to this reasonable and always justified resistance, is Freud in 1927. See, he does slightly a better job than the nutcase from the Yale lecture, because he's at least trying to refer to other papers and other, like actual scientists. My problem is that they're trying to give legitimacy to this nonsense. Anyway, Freud in 1927, it goes without saying that a civilization which leaves so large a number of its participants unsatisfied and drives them into revolt neither has nor deserves the prospect of a lasting existence. Anyway, he goes on. Nonetheless, it goes without saying that in the face of the continuous resistance and in the face of their own deeply uncertain future, the insatiable and malignant appetites of affected white people persist. How to think of this affliction? How to think of what happens to people when infiltrated by appetites of this sort? What deformations result? What reductions? What losses? What limitations? What blindness when all peoples, except those designated one's own, are violently forced to constitute a servant class, a servant category? Whiteness promises and delivers privilege, but fails to disclose the deforming afflictions it also delivers. These afflictions are grounded in truncated and defiled relations to a huge swath of our fellow humans, our surrounding objects, in order for the lazy Susan to keep operating, in order for it to be constantly filled with objects placed there to serve. Its putative masters must repudiate identificatory access to all of those objects, must replace the magic and enchantment of identification with the objectifications and manipulations of disidentification. Here we have $50 word salad. If you hear me mention this when people use this in debate, this is what I'm talking about. It's not that using big words alone is a problem. It's just that he's trying to make himself sound smarter by using words that are just way bigger than necessary. And it's generally done just to kind of like, lure people into a trance, just go along with like what they're saying. Anyway, they must in effect replace the possibility of love, incorporation, and development with the certainty of indifference, repudiation, and stasis. The objects placed on the lazy Susan have necessarily been taken out of their native contexts. Taken. They are placed there in postures of mandatory submission, whether to the bullwhip or to the gun, whether to written or to unwritten law. Whiteness generates a state of mind that aims to turn these human objects, sources of appetite satisfaction, into mere objects. Hoping to find support for this unsupportable illusion, affected people are drawn to believe these living beings are in fact gutted of real life, and as such naturally suited to serve. Now, I could go on like with this kind of crap forever. I'll actually leave this link in the description, but I'm going to go over his actual paper because it kind of gets a little bit into what I think, has to do with why this guy got into this, nutcasery in the first place. But I read just a little more. Whiteness leaves its afflicted hosts eviscerated. They are blindly driven to deny this evisceration by collecting trophies. These trophies, excitedly displayed as the products of dominion, are meant as evidence of a fictive vitality. Whiteness, in effect, plants this evidence by way of a false equation, domination equal vitality and goodness. Within the framework of this false equation, trophies of domination work in the same way that fetishes do, filling the gap created by an unspeakable absence. The real equation, the non-false one, is more like domination equals loss. Whiteness's hosts cannot bear this loss, a loss that dare not speak its name. In effect, then, whiteness creates a closeted people who, in order to remain in the closet, inflict loss on others in the hope that others' losses of dignity, of life, of possibility, will cover their own. Let's read this last paragraph. Centuries of domination, centuries of apparent triumph, and still we can see, or rather sense in whiteness, afflicted white people, the unresolvable persistence of both of those voices, that dreadful mix, malignant domination outside, malignant evisceration inside, marks the sickly, pathognomic core of parasitic whiteness at work. So, basically, this is just like a really much more articulate $50 word salad version of the kind of shit that Dr. Kalani was putting in her talk. He's just being much more poetic about it. In fact, when we read his paper, you'll see kind of what I mean. Is just that he puts all this extra flowery language in it to the point where it's like you think you're reading the Declaration of Independence or something, and not because of the actual title or the content, but just the way that everything in it is made to just sound more flowery and fancy. Because he's trying to, I guess, appeal to the more intellectual types, whereas I don't know who she thought she was appealing to, because other than just the fact that she more or less sounded like a Black Lives Matter protester in the middle of a riot going on a rant about white people. But anyway, so So let's continue by looking at his other paper. So here is the paper itself by Donald Moss on having whiteness. The beginning of it is basically just kind of like a reprint of what we were looking at earlier. So, but I'm going to move. So I'm going to move down. But that is, this is not a traditionally organized psychoanalytic text. No clear path links my argument to that of my predecessors. So it's funny. It's again we're looking at like no science. Just let's go on a rant about white people. But anyway. This former peculiarity might be the product of my effort to braid together two incompatible voices, to write simultaneously from both inside and outside the affliction I mean to study. Each position, inside and outside, offers an irreducibly distorted view, the one by the limits of sincere introspection, the other by the limits of theorized observation. The two perspectives turbulently converged during a recent experience in South Africa. He goes on to detail basically just his experience in South Africa. And he's a lot of like what's going on here as far as what is in this talk, or not talk, but paper, is just him detailing some personal experience of his that kind of led him to where he's at, apparently. So let me go further down. Whiteness as a way of being and a way of knowing. In what follows, I will capitalize whiteness to signify parasitic whiteness, an acquired multidimensional condition. So remember, this is a mental health professional referring to whiteness itself as a condition. 1, in a way of being. 2, a mode of identity. 3, a way of knowing and sorting the objects constituting one's human surround. Whiteness should not be confused with lowercase whiteness, a commonly used signifier of racial identity. Parasitic whiteness, he's like trying to assign like a new version of whiteness, is like, well, if it's capitalized, then we're talking about the mental illness, and if it's lowercase, then we're just referring to a signifier of racial identity. Parasitic whiteness infiltrates our drives early on. The infiltrated drive binds id, ego, superego into a singular entity, empowered to dismiss and override all forms of resistance. The drive apparatus of whiteness divides the object world into two distinct zones. In one, the whiteness-infiltrated drive works in familiar ways, inhibited, checked, distorted, transformed, susceptible, that is, to standard neurotic deformations. In the other, however, none of this holds true. There, the liberated drive goes rogue, unchecked, and unlimited, inhibited by neither the protests of its objects nor the counterforces of its internal structures. Any infant is vulnerable to the parasite of whiteness. The extent of the infant's vulnerability depends on how the infant is mapped, how it is positioned, where it is placed. All infants orient themselves in relation to a first initial mapping line. On this side of the line will live its familiars, us, while on that side will live its strangers, them. For every infant, this mapping line founds, delineates, and defines the place of the stranger. As such, it marks the site of the first organized and enduring representation of an external source of anxiety. Beginning with the onset of stranger anxiety, the infant, while working to find its place in the world, will perpetually aim for safety, avoiding, as best it can, any external object located on the dangerous stranger side of the line. Parasitic whiteness works to turn this foundational line into an impermeable wall, to permanently fix the place of the non-white stranger on the far side of the wall, there to be sorted and categorized and eventually mastered. This just plays more into the same bullshit that I saw in the slide that they were presenting when they're trying to get critical race theory into the schools where my kids go, was they have this slide suggesting that white babies prefer other white babies. Anyway, our merely unruly sexualities may exert a constant pressure to eroticize the bodies and beings of strangers, transgressively aiming to defy the wall, to integrate those bodies and beings, to take them in. But the rogue sexualites of parasitic whiteness add to that. They negatively eroticize non-white bodies and beings. These objects now marked are wanted still, but wanted not to be taken in, but simply to be taken, not to be loved but to be hated. Holding these objects in place, inflicting pain on them, this sadism becomes the exquisite and economical solution to any apparent conflict between wanting and hating. Parasitic whiteness further demeans its non-white bodies and beings by way of a naturalizing system of naming and classification. Once it has mapped and transformed its non-white objects into such fixed taxonomical category, the rogue sexuality of parasitic whiteness can expand its aim. It permanently maps them as external and away, and from there, wherever that is, these objects are available for limitless use, limitless labor of limitless kind. So he's describing whiteness as again, a mental illness that apparently infants can basically be, that's when they get infected with this parasitic whiteness, and that it leads to just, instantly dehumanizing anybody who's not white. There's really no science in this. That's why I said earlier, it's like we're just going to kind of go on rants about white people. But he's making all these declarations, but he's not quoting anything that resembles like studies that he would have done to confirm any of this. It's like, I don't even understand how this can be a paper. So now we get to the personal reflections part, because I can't just sit here and read all that nonsense. But he's describing his own personal experience with the infiltration of whiteness. He says, the infiltration of whiteness can begin modestly. For 2 years, when we were 3 and 4, Bobby was my best friend. Bobby had a speech impediment due to a severe cleft palate. I was the only kid on the block who could understand him when he spoke. I loved Bobby. When school started, though, I went to a regular school while Bobby was sent for one for disabled kids. That was the end of the friendship. We never spoke again. I wanted no part of him now. Something was wrong, weak, and deficient about him. I wanted only to be with kids of my kind. Bobby was now part of nature, part of what I would learn about. He was no longer like me, one of those who would do the learning. No one told me to respond this way. No one told me not to. I had what amounted to a revelation. I simply shunned him, turned away, that shunning, that act of mapping now, as an object, no longer a subject like me. This marked the site where whiteness might begin its work. So he's talking about something that happened back when he was 3 years old, where he had a friend who had a cleft palate, and that he just later rejected him. I just find it really strange that he thinks that he can have these huge articulate memories about shit that he did when he was 3 years old. Anyway, I had drawn a line, established a premise. Whiteness could then opportunistically inaugurate a stepwise expansion of this premise, proceeding as though it were my ally. Together, we then sought and found more markers of deficiency until we finally arrived at color. Color offers whiteness, now firmly housed, an apparently limitless, instantly available field for expansion, providential and clear, an opportunity to realize itself, to arrive at its adult, fully developed form. Color provides a universe of suitable objects, placed there like gifts, to be captured and crushed, all at a whim. Like for so many Gullivered children, ants are there to be crushed underfoot, butterflies to be locked in a jar. These crushed ants and suffocated butterflies, victims of nearly cellular narcissism? Like narcissism on the cellular level? What? Anyway, offer whiteness a platform on which to begin. Once begun, the rest can seem like simple common sense, the preservation of the host's proper place somewhere near the apex, within the only proper and permanent order of things. But first, before arriving at its fully developed form, whiteness has to begin. For this, nearly anything, even a little boy's cleft palate, will do. Whiteness began its work only after I had done mine. I had loved Bobby. I was a lonely kid, and he was the best thing I had. I was prepared to lose him, in fact. Not only unprepared, but in retrospect... he was unprepared, sorry. Not only unprepared, but in retrospect unable. My fear, my sadness, my loss at 3 years old. Bobby and I would no longer be together, had been erased by my mapping revelation, his wound confirming my intactness. This seemed a fair exchange for losing a friend. I was grateful to have escaped from an unbearable loss, the fragile attachment of love and friendship that had been transformed into the robust attachments of hatred and revulsion. So somehow, he's saying that whiteness infected him because, again, he had this childhood friend at 3 and 4 years old, that had a cleft palate, and then he rejected him, and it's all because of whiteness infecting him. Anyway, All Whiteness needs for a receptor site is an original act of vertical mapping. Whiteness begins with this verticality. It then infiltrates you. You can feel it. It's like getting high. A new reality, an enhanced stature, a special community. You can breathe easier, feel protected and watched over, and then you can look down, below you, and you can see the others like Bobby, and they seem to be drifting even further downward, towards some bottom. And unlike you, they appear helpless and unprotected. They fade into the distance, further and further away. Over there, permanently other now, permanently elsewhere. This is why this sounds like poetry and not like a scientific journal article. Anyway, parasitical whiteness, in fact, functions as inherited property does. You receive your due. You simply claim that what you suddenly realize is yours for the claiming. See whiteness as property. Oh, okay. So he does cite another scientific study from another bullshit article. Anyway, but with this claiming comes a fear of a crash, of losing everything, of having it taken away. So parasitic whiteness, bent first on dominion, now bends toward aversive and then violent defense. Defense now a permanent necessity. Safety turns into anxiety, freedom into paranoia, escape into entrapment. Parasitic whiteness, promising health, delivers sickness. He goes on to just discuss his whiteness and how it manifested by saying things like, I shunned the neighborhood's blind peddler. My beloved Aunt Belle suddenly became too fat. JT, the man who taught me how to drink out of a Coke bottle, turned into the black guy whose bottles I ought to avoid. My immigrant grandparents became stupid peasants, but these were merely personal relationships, each one weighed down with the meanings and histories, weighed down in fact by love. But once these fraught transformations were in place, once I was willing to accept them, there emerged the easiest and most global transformation of all, as though I were simply learning to name a natural feature of my new surround. Negroes had become Schwarzes, and with that I was now mapped in the real world. I was no longer merely white, I was white. I had property and properties, and with this last malign turn, this turn away from mere locality and toward a place in the natural world, parasitic whiteness had firmly established its place in a compliant host. I knew the whole thing was a betrayal. Whiteness regularly leaves a little space like this for consciousness and memory, for the awareness of one's own treachery. Whiteness maps this awareness through the residue of an original innocence, as yet another object to dominate an interior disability, and as such a threat to the whole enterprise. Weak, sniveling, and regretful, that must itself be kept ordered, maintained, and hidden, in effect sent away to an interior school. All of this came in the form of a terrible flash, more revelation than thought. Bobby and the blind man belonged with those others, in that school, somewhere both far away and barren. Parasitical whiteness works this way, by opening up and mapping a faraway territory, easy to populate, easy to mine, and easy to diminish, a territory capacious enough to hold all the creatures of the earth, while promising its hosts that only they, intoxicated by real privilege and imaginary wholeness, will maintain both the power and the right to remain safe and secure right where they are. A ghost of Bobby seems to have come back to me, in the person of a current patient of mine, also born with a speech impediment. As I listen to him, I can see and hear Bobby in his tiny head, his nasal twang not quite forgiving, but simply welcoming, no matter how long it's taken for me to get there, over to his side of the line, or in what amounts to the same identificatory thing, to bring him over to mine, not realizing the gift he is giving me. My patient treats me like an intimate. So, in his clinical work, he says, in the anecdotes that follow, I mean to illustrate some of the map's workings as they emerge in two very different clinical situations. The first may exemplify a kind of remission. The other may point toward an effective method of treatment. Anyway, case one was this guy that was apparently racist. And so he goes into just discussing with the guy how he can never really seem to fix him or whatever, but that it was just kind of a loud, nasty guy. Case number two was a woman who came to him, for growing disgust at her male partner, meaning her husband. She can barely tolerate his neediness, his insistence that they always be together, increasingly restless and sexually unsatisfied. What the fuck does this have to do with whiteness? People of every race have these kinds of problems in their relationships. Anyway, increasingly restless and sexually unsatisfied, she's begun to threaten either affairs or a breakup. Her partner responds forcefully and repeatedly with an image that is not long in presence of their relationship. How the hell does this kind of shit get into a scientific journal about whiteness? And I guess he goes on to say something about like how she has like a pink monkey inside of her. She gives it details of a dream. I am with some people in a sexual situation, not sure of anything, who they are, what they want. One is a boy or a woman, I can't tell. One it's a woman, but she has a penis. It's a little boy's penis. I'm excited. Then it's a woman again, and I look at myself, not sure what I have. What I am. A boy, a woman. Whether I have a penis, I'm excited. Everything is about this exciting. What the fuck does this have to do with whiteness? Later in the article, he just kind of gives like what happened to this patient, and basically what it amounts to is that the patient like left her husband and went and found a different lover who they get along with better. But anyway, countering the epistemology of entitled dominion, our work here was informed by what seems to be an epistemology of identificatory obligation. Instead of aiming to segregate and dominate the potentially disruptive image of the pink monkey, the patient found a way to identify with it, to take it into herself, in an act of that she herself called kind. We are the same flesh, the pink monkey and me. She said with this, she reconfigured the strange as the curious, turned the thread of disorganization to the promise of surprise. Anyway, this kind of clinical work, dismantling perverse structures, organized around an epistemology of entitled dominion, turns interior vertical maps into interior horizontal ones. As such, this work eliminates at least one psychic receptor site for parasitic whiteness, replace repulsion by desire, and fear by delight, and a portion of once perverse maps turned horizontal. The once reviled monkey now dazzles, now an icon of vital possibility instead of devitalized excess. And with that, the transformation. Parasitic whiteness loses some access to a now less susceptible host. Psychoanalytic work, then, need not properly target whiteness itself here. Instead, it can effectively target the psychic receptor sites that provide whiteness the interior vertical mapping in which it depends. The vertical map disrupts the identificatory bond in what might once have bound subject to object. The bond persists, though reshaped and hardened now into a vertical format. Identification morphs into disidentification, similarity into difference, affectionate care into sadistic cruelty. Diminish the spread and influence of these interior vertical receptor sites, and indirectly the parasite of whiteness is dislodged. Oh, this is so bad. Anyway, concluding note, where to stand, on what stable platform. To turn whiteness into an object for thought, one must first look for a point of stillness. This point actually does not exist. After all, whiteness in its mature form generates a volatile totality from which there is no clear exit, no clear escape. To pursue that exit, to hope for even temporary escape of getting outside and looking back, of seeing where you've seem to have been, depends, I think, on a kind of conceptual mobility, a willingness to use metaphors, and smiles for only as long as they serve. What is all this bullshit? Anyway, for me, here the most important of those metaphors have been parasite, mapping, and verticality. Each seemed to me both stable and elastic, capable of simultaneously supporting thought and providing a jumping-off point. So I guess to sum up the insanity here, which I'm going to apologize to anybody who had, suffered through that along with me, because a lot of it I wouldn't say was necessarily entertaining to listen to, but it kind of points to the fact that you have this guy who's a paid professional who submitted this as an article to a journal identifying whiteness and going on to discuss what is the pathology of whiteness as a condition, and tries to make some suggestions on how to treat it, and identifies whiteness itself as what just sounds like self-absorbed narcissism, self-importance, an idea that you're superior to everything else. And, he just talks about some things that are just natural, like people, they overcome it, but there are a lot of people who have issues with revulsion of people with disabilities or, whatever. And it was just a big mess of bullshit. And honestly, the only reason I think this guy's going to get any attention is just the part that he released to the public. The rest of it, it just was incoherent babble. And I just don't understand how somebody could submit this as a paper. It just seems like he wanted attention for the first few paragraphs that we went over that he's already made available. as just kind of like a precursor to this book he thinks he's going to write. But if his book is going to be like this, it's like, ugh. So in the next episode, I'm going to talk to you guys about what's going wrong with the social sciences in general. There's a current crisis with reproducibility from psychology studies. And the same thing is true of sociology studies. And there was a group of 3 activists who got together in what has been referred to as the grievance studies affair. They basically wrote fake articles that had woke themes to them and submitted them to sociology and medical journals and got a lot of them approved. And aside from the fact that some of the stuff that they submitted was funny, the part that's not funny is that what we're looking at here is just the degeneration of the scientific method in the social sciences. And the reason that that's dangerous is because laws are made based on social science. Like you can actually change, the rules of society with that kind of stuff. And if this kind of nonsense continues, where we're going to address whiteness as if it's a mental illness, where does that lead? What is the final end game there? I regret that this particular study was perhaps not as entertaining as watching, Aruna Kalani, go insane on the screen for you. But it seems to me that this guy's got his own problems. He's just really good at being articulate. So it sounds like more sane, but articulation, being articulate and using $50 words every other sentence does not actually mean that there's any substance to what you're saying. But it makes you look good, which is the reason why people like Vosh, Stefan Molyneux, different people I've debated with in the past. I've never debated Vosh. Some of my listeners want me to, but I don't know if it's going to be worth it in the end. He doesn't. There's only so much of somebody who just shouts over you and throws word salad at you that you can take before it's like, this is just a waste of my time. But anyway, so when you debate people like that, they just kind of throw $50 words into everything to make themselves look smarter than they actually are. And to the audience, that can make, the person look like they're winning a debate, even if they didn't really say anything of any value. Politicians do this shit all the time. So anyway, thanks for tuning in and suffering through that with me. I'll be working on more content, and I've also got some other stuff coming up in regards to more positive things about what I think will help people in the Black communities to actually reform, what's going on in their communities. There was some activism that was recently done about this that I took, some recordings of that I plan to use for that. And thanks again for tuning in. Please like, subscribe, share, ring the bell. I actually have enough subscribers to monetize, but I'm not really jumping on that right now. I do have a Subscribestar and a Patreon, but it's not really a priority to me at this point. I'm currently unemployed and injured, so I'm not even working at the moment, but I have, the money coming to me. So I'm not worried about the money. It's one of the reasons I've been taking the time to do all of these, is that it gives me something to do that's constructive instead of just sitting around and playing video games. If for some reason down the line I do decide to try to make some money at this, I'll make you guys aware of it ahead of time. But really my motive right now is just that I see that there's a lot of things that people are just lying about and getting away with. That's what got all of this started. That's why I started my Kyle Rittenhouse videos that you can see. That's why I started the talk on the racism that Asians have been running into, and how it's actually not necessarily connected to COVID, and that it's actually not a bunch of white people beating up Asian people. There are just so many things that people are just lying about, and that drives me batty. And that's why I got into, being an independent journalist back in 2008. So anyway, thanks for listening, and I hope you guys enjoyed it, as difficult as it was to listen to. And I hope you'll tune in for the next one. Thanks again.